Hey, InterVarsity alumni. This is After 4, your podcast for navigating life after graduation. This is both an exciting and potentially tricky transition that you're making, and you might feel a little unsure about the coming weeks and months. We're here to provide you with expert advice, practical skills, and plenty of encouragement as you learn how to keep saying yes to Jesus in your new context. This is After 4, and this podcast is for you, alumni. What's up, alumni? Welcome to After 4, your podcast for navigating life after graduation. I'm your host and guide, John Steele. Friends, before we jump into the episode, let me tell you this. Your fellow alumni are committed to encouraging you to get plugged into a church. It's an imperfect place, we all know that, but there's clearly something really important about being connected to other believers wherever you land after graduation. And Steve Moen of Washington State University, class of 1982, has a step-by-step guide for you in this week's alumni yearbook entry. If you don't have one in hand, grab a pen right now because here comes a list of his best practices. Steve says, after graduation and any time I've moved, I've made finding a new home church a priority. The following steps have been very helpful. 1. Check with friends, staff workers, pastors, and other contacts for church recommendations in your new area. 2. Contact local staff from known and trusted ministries like Young Life, Campus Life, InterVarsity, NAVS for their suggestions. 3. Identify possible churches from trusted denominations and independent Bible churches from a local internet search. Check their websites for doctrinal statements and activities. 4. Visit the church office and chat with the pastor as early as possible, before starting work even. And I think he means before you even secure your next job in that location, not necessarily get up super early in the morning and meet them before you go to work. 5, make a prioritized list of churches to visit and start hitting them up. Join a Sunday school and appropriate midweek Bible study if possible. 6, ask God to make it clear where He wants you. Be patient, be faithful, and really engage with each church you visit. 7, once you settle on a church, talk to a pastor about your ministry activity, experiences, and gifting so they know some of your background. And last but not least, 8, stay involved and follow God's leading. I've seen God use my IV training, experience, and passion many times in every congregation we've joined, though it took a while in a couple cases. Hope someone finds this helpful as you go make disciples. Thank you so much, Steve. This is an awesome list. So many helpful, practical tips to apply here. Hey, if you have some advice or a word of encouragement that you'd like to share with your fellow alumni, send me an email at alumni@intervarsity.org or a DM at After4Pod on Instagram. I would really love to hear from you and the things that you want to share with other alumni like you. All right, so we've spent the last couple of weeks talking about being wrong as an important part of healthy conflict and disagreement. We have a position or an opinion, we share it with others who think differently, and hearing their perspective makes us say, I wonder if I might be wrong in the way I'm thinking about this. And then we go through the process of deciding if we need to change our position on the topic. If you'd like to hear more from those conversations, check the show notes. I'll link those episodes. But this week, we're jumping to the other end of that spectrum, and we're asking, when we find ourselves in conflict with someone, is it possible for both of us to be right, even if we disagree? We live in such a polarized society that I think it's easy for us to just assume that everyone else is wrong, or that in any given conversation, one of us must be wrong. But could there be more space for being right about something than we realize? Well, author, apologist, and good friend of the podcast, Rick Mattson, is joining us this week, and he's going to help us get a better understanding for whether or not we can both be right, even when we're on seemingly opposite sides of an issue. A couple of things to know about Rick. He's a philosopher and a thinker, and he's going to take us to some really interesting places as we consider right and wrong and getting clear about which issues we're actually in conflict about. So let's dive in. Here's Rick, and this one's for you, alumni. Rick, welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, thanks, John. Good to see you here on, well, we're not on Zoom. What are we on?
No, this is Riverside that we're on.
Riverside. Okay.
Yes. Yes, it's good to see you. You are a return guest. It's been a couple of years, but you have joined us on After 4 before, and so it's nice to have you back again.
I must not have been horrible the
No,
first time around. So
absolutely
thanks for
not.
the return invite.
Yes, for sure. When it came time for a series like we're having and a conversation around right and wrong and talking through difficult issues, I was like, there's a few people that I would like to invite into this conversation, and Rick Mattson is absolutely one of them because you have conversations with people that you disagree with all the time. And it's like part of your job.
Well, I'm right all the time. So
Then we have the right guy for this conversation today.
the
This
right
is
guy.
perfect.
Yes, yeah.
Rick, before we fully dive into our topic here today, would you just do me the honor of giving us a short introduction for our listeners?
Sure. My wife Sharon and I live in St. Paul, Minnesota. We've been here a long time. I've been on InterVarsity staff since 1981, John.
Nice.
So just finishing up 43 years. Yeah.
Wow.
It's been a good run and continues. And these days I serve as a traveling speaker, trainer, and apologist for InterVarsity all over the country. This year I was at 22 different campuses. Mainly I work with graduate students. So I'm in what we call GFM, Grad Faculty Ministries, in InterVarsity, but I still do some undergrad work as well. Sharon and I have 2 kids and 7 grandkids.
Wow.
How about that? Let's hear it for the grandkids. And for hobbies, I enjoy reading theology and philosophy, and I'm an avid golfer. I'm also an adjunct professor at the University of Northwestern here in the Twin Cities in philosophy. And my alma mater, InterVarsity alumnus from Southwest Minnesota State University, Marshall, Minnesota, where I grew up. And I write books, John.
That's right.
Faith is Like Skydiving.
Yes.
And Witnessing the Academy is the new book.
Okay.
And I'm working on a book with an atheist now. So talk about someone with whom you disagree. My friend Tom and I writing a book together, and we, deeply disagree about things, Tom Jump and myself. So I'm in practice right now, John.
Okay, that's perfect. Wow, I'm excited to read that book when that comes out. We'll talk about more resources and ways people can stay connected with your work. I'd like to hear a bit more about that before we end our conversation. Rick, you've alluded to a couple of these things, but can you just give us a little bit of a peek inside your world of philosophy, discipleship of mind, apologetics? Like, what is it that has drawn you into this world? What keeps you there? Why do you like existing in this space?
Yeah, well, I am kind of an abstract thinker. You should see Sharon and me trying to talk, John. She's a farm girl. She's got 2 feet planted firmly on the ground. She's very practical.
Nice.
I'm a, theorist, head in the clouds all the time. It seems like we could barely have a conversation even after all these years. And it's also a source of humor in our lives. So we try not to take ourselves too seriously. But I've just always loved the life of the mind. I always wanted heart and head to be involved in my Christian faith. So when I was in college, I read Jim Sire's The Universe Next Door, which is a catalog, a comparison of worldviews. I was so taken by that book. And I realized that there's other worldviews, neighboring worldviews. They have different beliefs than mine. What are those differences? Can we talk about those differences? Who's right? Who's wrong? Let's figure it out together.
Yeah.
I was really taken by that book, and it just opened up this world of the life of the mind, philosophy, sometimes what we call a philosophical theology. And it's kind of the intersection between philosophy and theology, and I've just always really loved dwelling there. So I read a lot of books on the historical reliability of the Bible, the Gospels. So Craig Blomberg and others.
Okay.
Stephen Evans is a popular philosopher that I enjoy reading. And then some of the old pros like Alvin Plantinga, Nicholas Walterstorff, Douglas Groothuis. They make a valuable contribution to the body of Christ and are often underappreciated because people think it's just too abstract or too technical or too theoretical.
Okay.
But these folks really provide an important contribution to the work of the church. And I think we need to value them more than we do.
Well, probably some names for our listeners to add to their reading lists, people to look up and explore. If they're looking for a more challenging read in some ways, that could provide some academic experience after graduation here.
Well, John, can I just say that both Jim Sire and Stephen Evans, yes, they're scholars, but they're also really good popularists. So you can read them, and a lot of their writings are written for a more popular audience and are very accessible.
Okay, that's really good to know. Gosh, Rick, as you talk about all of these things, I'm really grateful that you're here, because we find ourselves in a series right now where we are talking about conflict, disagreement, engaging in some of these things that are going to happen. Conflict is a natural part of our life. Our alumni after graduation, they're going to have to be prepared to step into places of conflict, and we want to be able to provide them with some tools so that they can do it in a healthy, humble, helpful way. And we just had a conversation last week with Jonna Fantz about what do I do if I think I might be wrong? Like, what are some indicators that I might be wrong, and how do I navigate that process of changing my mind? And I know that John is somebody that you know pretty well, and now we're going to explore the other side of the fence and talk about being right, but with a different twist of, is it possible that me and the person on the other side of this conversation or this argument even, is it possible for both of us to be right? So, living in the polarized world that we do, that seemed like maybe an interesting perspective to explore. Maybe not. Maybe the answer will be no that we come up with. I don't know. But Rick, I thought you would be the right guy to help us sort through that a little bit. But before we even dive into that question specifically, let's just even talk about the word right. Rick, when we talk about right, what does that even mean? Right comes up in a number of ways in our conversations. You want to make sure that you're on the right side of history. What does it mean to be morally right? What does it mean to be right according to the law? There's lots of different ways we could explore that. So I'd be interested to hear your perspective on even just the word right and what that means.
I think in the more subjective areas of life, right and wrong are more squishy. So we might have, in the area of preferences, let's say I prefer hymns and you prefer contemporary music. Well, which of us is right? Well, those are just preferences.
Interesting.
Or you might prefer baseball, I prefer golf, or you like chocolate and I like vanilla. And we can argue about which is best. Is chocolate better than vanilla? Well, it's really more a matter of perspective. There's really no ultimate right and wrong there. I don't know that God has a specific will about which is better.
Sure.
So when we devolve into arguments about right and wrong on personal preferences, it's probably not a productive conversation. Then I was thinking about strategies. There's different strategies to accomplish a goal. And here, again, I think you can both be right. So one example I thought of was, let's say we work for a company and we decide that we're going to buy advertising to promote our product. But someone on the team says, no, let's not spend money on advertising. Let's save the money, bank it, and simply rely on word of mouth. Well, who's right? I suppose at the end of 5 years, you could look back and you say, well, this was more strategic than that. But I don't know that you could say absolutely who's right or who's wrong in the particular moment of that argument. Or let's say for parenting, John, you might have thought about this one quite a bit. Let's say that one of the spouses has a philosophy that says a little bit hands off, you let your kids fail. In the long run, they're going to learn from their mistakes. The other spouse says, no. We can't let our kids fail. That will ruin their self-esteem. Let's try to prevent them from failing by kind of rescuing them and making sure that they're on the right path so they can build up momentum for making right choices. Well, that's two different strategies for parenting. Well, who's right? I don't know that you could actually say that there's a strict right and wrong there. If you went to either extreme, maybe you could make a more argument. But I think you could both be right. There's different ways to parent. Or at church, let's say some people in the church say, let's put our main efforts into evangelism. And then other people in the church said, no, let's put our main efforts and money into discipleship. Well, I think there's different ways to run a church, different neighborhoods, different settings, different contexts, different gifts in our congregation, different abilities. So I don't know that you could nail that down to an absolute right or wrong. So in the area of preferences and strategies, it seems like there wouldn't be very many situations where you could have an absolute right and wrong. Both people could be right. So I have more to say about that, but what are you thinking right now?
Well, what I'm wondering, with you leading with those two ideas, I'm wondering how many of the things that we get in arguments with people about are actually boiling down to preferences and strategies as opposed to actual absolutes, like things that should have an absolute answer, that we're actually putting the weight of wanting an absolute in something that actually is preferential or strategy related, and not this is something that has a yes or no answer to it.
Yeah, and I think when we live in a culture that's so polarized, where there's so much pressure to quote unquote take a stand, then even on smaller, I shouldn't say like church strategy is a small issue, but it's not an issue where there's an absolute right and wrong. And yet we tend to gravitate toward a position of right and wrong. We tend to make these into right and wrong issues when really they aren't, because our whole culture is doing that right now. And you're supposed to take a stand and speak up for your team and speak up for your side and raise your voice. And, there's all these slogans, and it's a subtle and sometimes not so subtle pressure to end up in these black and white issues when the issue itself isn't necessarily black and white.
Yeah, and maybe doesn't even need to be. Like, I wonder if there are places that we're trying to make something black and white that doesn't have to be, and it's okay. That are we leaning actually way more into our emotional response to somebody not wanting something the same way that we do, and so then we label that as, well, you're wrong, just because you don't feel the same way that I do about it.
Right. I hate to admit this, but I remember a few years ago sitting in a church meeting and looking across the aisle at people who were disagreeing with me on a church strategy, thinking to myself, these people are totally wrong. I'm the one with experience here. I know we should do it this way. I've seen what they want to do fail 11 times. Hopefully I didn't say to myself, these people are stupid.
Right.
Hopefully I didn't. Hopefully, or maybe I forgot that. But anyway, it's easy to look at people on the other side of an issue and say, these people are idiots. Don't they know? Haven't they read? Don't they have the experience? I'm right, they're wrong. And I think there's something unhealthy built into that attitude. What if my attitude was, okay, yeah, I think I have a pretty strong case for what I'm advocating here, but what about them? What is their case? And even if they're not that good at articulating it, how could I draw them out to make their side look as good as possible so that we could really look at the two options that we have here, or the three options, and evaluate them fairly, instead of me out articulating, if I'm even able, or just saying it better is how you get your way in a lot of these meetings. And to me, that's cheating. That's not really getting at the issue.
Yeah.
That's more about the skill, you might say, or the art of making an argument than the argument itself.
No, that is a really interesting thought of, so often our perspective on comparing ideas is, I want to make mine look as good as possible and yours look as bad as possible, as opposed to, I want both of these to look as accurate as possible so that we can have a good examination of both. And what would that look like if part of my job was actually to help my quote unquote opponent make as good and accurate of an argument as possible so that we can legitimately examine both sides together?
Yes, exactly. I don't want to get into, I don't want my life to be about debate skills.
Wow.
I want it to be about the issues itself. Themselves. I want it to be about the values and the preferences and the strategies. And let's really look at what the alternatives are here. And even if my opponent isn't that good at arguing for their side, how could I draw them out to make their side as good as possible so that we can look at the best of both sides and then make our decision. Wow, if churches did that, I think churches would make a lot better decisions. And yet, I'm so infuriated when I'm in meetings where the loudest voice in the room is the one that wins the day.
Yeah.
And I think, you know what? There's quiet wisdom sitting over there in the corner.
Yeah.
And that person is not all that comfortable speaking up, but they have really got something to say. They're a really good thinker, but they're never going to get heard in this meeting because the loudest voices carry the day. And that's a really bad way to make decisions, I think.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, how often do we give someone their way just because we want them to shut up?
We want them to shut up, or we're intimidated by what they say.
Yeah.
John, have you ever been around someone who can make anything sound plausible?
Oh, yeah.
It doesn't matter how idiotic it is. They can make it sound like we should do it. They could justify it because they're just good at kind of a turn of phrase.
Yes.
And I don't think that's a very good truth-seeking way to do things.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, Rick, as we talk a little bit here, and as I return to kind of the bigger idea that we're working our way through, can we both be right? I'm already starting to wonder. I mean, is the answer to that question "it depends"? I mean, is this one of these places that we're going to have to settle with an "it depends" response?
Yes, I think so. When you start to get into values and morality, then it's more of a binary issue. There's, quite often there's going to be areas of gray, but in matters of fact, there's a right and wrong. So is Joe Biden president of the United States? Yes or no? Is Algeria the biggest country in Africa? Yes or no? Right or wrong? Is Cairo the capital of Egypt? Right or wrong? So if you get into philosophy and into logic, it's called the law of non-contradiction. And it says that two opposite things cannot both be true in the same way. If you're really talking about the same thing, two opposite responses cannot both be true. Now, if you're not talking exactly about the same thing, then what appear to be opposite responses could possibly be true. But I'll just give you a simple example. If I'm wearing shoes, I can't walk barefoot. Or if I'm married, I can't be single. Maybe I could be single in the future, but right now I am married. And so it is a matter of fact that I'm not single. So those are obvious ones where there's a real right and a wrong. And then you might get into something that's a little bit more tricky, a little bit more difficult. In Islam, God, Allah, is a singular deity. And then in Christianity, you have a slightly different kind of monotheism, where God is a trinity. Now, if we're talking about this, really the same topic, exactly the same topic, then both of those cannot be true. God cannot be a singular deity, and God cannot be Trinity at the same time. So it seems to me that one of those is right, one is wrong, or they're both, logically possible. It's logically possible that atheism is true. And so either would be right. But it cannot be the case that if we're really talking about God, that God can be both a singular deity as in Allah and God as Trinity as in Christianity. So that would be an example of a clear contradiction. Both of those cannot be right at the same time.
Yeah. So, again, as I'm thinking about maybe some specific things for us to be holding on to as we walk through these ideas, it's when we are approaching a potential conflict, or we find ourselves in conflict with somebody and trying to determine who's right. Am I right? Am I wrong? That it's important for us to decide, are we talking preferences here? Are we talking strategy here? Are we actually talking about the same thing?
Exactly.
And then if we get to the point where it's like, okay, it's not those first two and we are talking about the same thing, then maybe we are actually dealing with a binary choice. It's either it's either what you think, it's what I think, or there's another option that neither of us have considered, but it can't be both you and I. Correct. Okay.
So let's do another one. either, let's say I say God exists, and my friend Tom, that I'm writing a book with, says God doesn't exist. Well, we both can't be right there. Now, are we talking about the same thing? Are we talking about God? Okay, then we're going to have a conversation about defining God. If we can come to an agreement on a definition of God, and then I say, yes, this God that we agree on definitionally, that God exists, and Tom says that God doesn't exist, well, then one of us is right and one of us is wrong.
Yes. So then, I mean, boy, I'm trying to be careful about where I take us here. How many landmines do we want to step on today?
No, it's okay.
Well, I'm wondering.
We will be careful.
I'm wondering. I mean, are there some hot button issues today that are in our cultural conversations that we are caught up in a binary yes or no, you or me, one of us is right and one of us is wrong, that maybe isn't quite so cut and dry? Maybe is that the case for many of the sort of culture war conversations that we find ourselves in the middle of today?
Yeah, I think so. But you mentioned the word humility early on, and I think it's important to adopt a posture of humility as we get into these more complex issues. So I think humility recognizes the limitations of one's own abilities and thinking, but humility also recognizes the complexity of the issues and doesn't become dismissive. It's like, oh, I understand that, and you don't. Well, when these issues are super complex, do any of us really understand them perfectly? Not perfectly. And it seems like there's different issues that I have varying levels of understanding of. And so if I've done a ton of reading and worked on a certain issue, I can have a little bit more confidence there mixed in with my humility. But if I haven't done a ton of reading and I've only read the headlines and I just need to stick up for my side, then maybe the humility is out the window. I'm slipping more into overconfidence, and I don't recognize the complexity of these issues. So let's just take immigration, a hot button issue. Let's say one person says, well, I think we should expand immigration, open up the borders. Another person says, no, we need to contract immigration. We need to protect our borders, protect the populace. Well, is there a right and a wrong there? It almost seems like it's a strategy for running a country more than it's a moral absolute. Is there a moral component to it? I would say so.
Yeah.
Well, then let's make that a separate conversation that's attached to this one. And let's go over there. Let's cross that bridge and let's have a discussion about the morality of national hospitality or national protection, let's say. Let's have a discussion about that morality. And then once we have that discussion, we can import that discussion back into the strategy of talking about immigration. Probably most people aren't going to go to those lengths. They're just going to they're going to bumper sticker and sloganize this topic. And the topic deserves, because it is a complex topic, it deserves a lot more I think, sophistication than kind of bumper stickering it. So that's just one example. This is how philosophers think. You have to take apart the issue and then look at each part of the issue in and of itself before you go back and make any pronouncement about the whole issue itself. So first you deconstruct. In other words, you break down, and then you reconstruct in order to voice an opinion. And then at some point you say, well, is this a moral black and white issue of which God has a very definite will? Or is this more of a strategy? And God is asking us to kind of work it out with his more general guidance.
Okay, so preference, strategy, morality, or fact. When we find ourselves in conflict with someone else, it is really important to define terms and have nuanced conversations. Are we really disagreeing about something with a definitive right and wrong, issues of fact? Or are we actually disagreeing on issues of preference or strategy, or even morality, which, if we're honest, can also be a little more gray? How often do we put our preferences on a pedestal, knowingly or not, and then say it has to be this way when it actually doesn't, and then we get unnecessarily upset when someone disagrees with us? It is possible that their preferences or strategies might also be workable options in the conversation that we're having. And through all of this, it's really important for us to be students of Scripture and disciples of Jesus who are learning His way and allowing our preferences, strategies, and morals to be impacted by that, by Him. All the while, still maintaining a humble posture, knowing that not everyone will acknowledge that pursuit as a useful rubric or metric for making these kinds of decisions. And we're actually going to have an episode that's all about that exact idea, about being a disciple first, in just a few weeks, so stay tuned for that. But if you have thoughts about our conversation so far, send us an email at alumni@intervarsity.org or a DM at After4Pod on Instagram. Let me know what you thought about today's episode. I would really love to hear your thoughts. For next week, though, we're going to continue in this vein of being right, but we're going to ask the question, is there something better than being right? Find out next week. Until then, thanks for tuning in, and I will see you in the after, alumni. Hey, thanks so much for joining us today, alumni. If there was anything that you learned, really enjoyed, or that encouraged you from today's episode, would you send us a DM or tag us in a story? We'd love to hear about it. You can find us at After4Pod on Instagram and Facebook. And if you haven't already, take just a second to unlock your phone and subscribe to the podcast. If your platform lets you, leave us a rating and a review. And if you like what we're doing here, share us with your InterVarsity or other post-graduation friends. Thanks again for listening, and I will see you in the after, alumni.